Welcome everybody, and since the introduction of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe in 2018, consent dialogues for data collection are omnipresent. They are omnipresent on the web and they are omnipresent on the mobile device. And I guess most people here in this room have some form of emotional connection to consent dialogues. And one of the main reasons, or the main reason why we have so many consent dialogues is that if there's no real proper reason to collect data, you can always ask the user whether or not he would agree to data collection and processing of the personal data written in Article 6A of the GDPR. And this is basically the reason why there are so many consent dialogues flooded when you start using new apps. However, the GDPR also has a strong opinion on how consent should be collected. And for this, you can look into Recital 32, Conditions for Consent, and it states consent should be given by a clear affirmative act establishing a freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of the data subject's agreement to the processing of personal data. Oof. But there are 5 keywords you should take away. First of all, consent has to be clearly affirmative. So you have to say, yes, I want data collection. It has to be freely given, so you have to have a choice of some form, and you must not be coerced towards giving consent. It has to be specific, informed, and unambiguous, meaning that you must not be confused as a user whether or not you're giving consent or doing something else. I'm not a lawyer, so everything I'm saying is my understanding of the GDPR. If you have specific questions, you should ask a lawyer for data protection law. However, based on those keywords, let's have a look at different collection consent dialogues. This is a selection of 3 different ones, which are more or less representative of what we have seen. And if we go through those dialogues, by the way, if you're wondering where the consent dialogue is here, it's basically that little text here you can barely make out. If you go through those different dialogues, you can already see that they might not be really in accordance with what the GDPR has in mind concerning consent. For example, the first dialogue, well, you do have text, so you're probably somewhat informed. However, you only have a single button. The button is Einverstanden, which is German for I agree. So it is affirmative and it's unambiguous. However, it's definitely not freely given. Of course, you only can say yes, but you cannot say no. So freely given is out, so this dialogue is probably not proper. Well, the second dialogue, it does also have some issues. First of all, there's barely any text, sorry, you're not informed. And also, it's not unambiguous. You have to say sign in with Apple, and sign in with Apple doesn't say yes, I agree to data collection. So yeah, this dialogue is out again. So we are left with the third dialogue. And this dialogue does look proper on a first glance. Of course, we have multiple buttons. One of the buttons is yes, I accept. The second button is no, reject all. So you do definitely have a choice. And well, on the first glance, you would think, yes, it's also freely given. However, you can see some design decisions being taken here. And one of the major design decisions is the I accept button being highlighted. It has a thicker font. It is highlighted by a blue background. So the first thing you do as a user, you open your applications, you see that dialog, oh yeah, big button, press it. And then you have given consent. And previous work has shown that this is nudging users towards giving consent. They're coerced towards saying, yes, I want you to collect my data, even though they might not actually really want that. And we were interested in studying those design decisions on a large scale in mobile consent dialogues. And what we did for this is we created a framework to do limited interaction traffic and dialogue collection. We took an iPhone, we gained root access to the iPhone and configured it to pipe all the traffic through a man-in-the-middle proxy before it goes into the internet, and we're collecting all the requests being done by the applications run on the iPhone. Furthermore, we used Appium to extract all the on-screen information. So Appium allows you to interact with the screen of the phone and get all the buttons, the text, the structure of the screen from the currently running application. And we store that information in a database as well while running the different apps. And last but not least, Appium also allows you to interact with apps, which allowed us to, if we detect the consent dialog, to say, yes, try to collect my data, or say, no, I do not want you to collect my data. And we did not only do this for Apple, we copied this setup and also performed this applied this framework to Android. And then we set out and downloaded a bunch of apps from the App Store of Android and Apple, respectively, from the main categories, the top 100 each. And in the end, we were able to run 2,134 apps for Android and 1,520 apps for iOS. And we set out to look at very, very basic design decisions of any consent dialog detected. We wanted to know if the app stops after refusing consent. So if you refuse, the app stops, the consent is not freely given. We wanted to know whether or not the accept button is highlighted by size or by color. So to nudge the user towards saying, yes, sure, I want to press that big blue button right in front of my face. And fourth, we wanted to know whether or not the accept button is ambiguously labeled, meaning that you have to press OK or continue instead of yes, I agree, which might confuse a user into whether or not he has just given consent or not. And we also looked whether or not, even though there is some form of accept button, if there's a reject button, if you have a choice to say no, I do not want data collection. And last but not least, we looked into whether the reject button is ambiguously labeled. Some dialogs present you with a more options button, for example, which means that you have to press the more options button and then usually deselect data collection purposes individually to then indirectly reject the data collection. So what did we encounter while doing this? Well, first of all, we encountered roughly 450 different consent dialogues while running all the apps. So the overall percentage of dialogues in apps is not that high. And out of all those dialogues, we can already see 50% have an ambiguous reject button. So you don't really have a clear reject all, no data collection button. You have to do something more, which is not as clear for the user to understand. And secondly, 40% do have an accept button, but they do not present you with a choice to reject. So again, this is clearly influencing the validity of the consent given. And also, which was somewhat surprising, 15 apps stopped working after refusing consent, meaning that you think, oh yeah, perfect, I do have a choice. I can say no, I do not want data collection. You press no and the app closes. So, well, kind of disappointing. We also looked how the different design choices are combined. And we then also plotted how the different combinations of bad design decisions, or user-unfriendly design decisions rather, are distributed across the different ranks of the apps. Because initially we thought, well, maybe only the really unpopular apps which do not really have a lot of funding do those design decisions because they don't know any better. And as you can see, it's more or less equally distributed across the ranks of all the apps. One of the things that was interesting is out of all the consent dialogues we have detected, only 9 did not apply any of those bad or user-unfriendly design decisions we set out to detect. And the second thing is that out of all the design combinations you can have, the most popular design combination was to have an ambiguous accept label. So for example, continue instead of I agree and no reject button. Meaning that you do not really have a choice and you do not really understand that the only choice you have is to agree. So this is quite interesting in my opinion because it shows some intent by the developers of those consent dialogues towards not even giving you a real choice and don't really want to tell you that you don't really have a good choice here concerning your data collection. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be really bad. I mean, yes, the consent dialogues are not really user-friendly. They don't present you with a lot of choice and they try to nudge you towards a certain direction. However, if they would at least stop the app from collecting your data before you have given some form of consent, it would be a start because then you can see the consent dialog, decide against using the app and at least close it. However, as I said before, we did collect traffic while running the apps and also before interacting with the consent dialog. And this is this plot. And the interesting part are the yellow bars, because yellow bar means that the data point listed here has been transmitted in combination with an identifier, and that identifier could potentially be used to link the data back to you as a user, meaning that this is personal data and covered by the GDPR. And as you can see at the bottom, at the x-axis, there was a lot of data being transmitted in combination with an identifier prior to any interaction with the consent dialog. However, you might think, well, yes, this might be a lot of data, but of course, after you agree to the consent dialog, a lot of more data is going to be transmitted. No. As you can see here on the x-axis, it's way smaller, and this was the additional data being transmitted after we agreed to data collection practices. I do not have a graph for what happens after you reject data collection, and the simple reason is there were very, very few dialogues that allowed you to have a clear yes, reject all button to even interact with, and fewer apps that continued running after you interacted with the consent dialog and rejected the data collection practices. So there was no point in plotting anything here. So what are the key takeaways? What do I want you to take home? Well, first of all, consent according to the GDPR has to be affirmative, free, specific, informed, and unambiguous. Most mobile consent dialogues fail at least at being free and unambiguous. This is what we measured. This is what I just presented to you. And lastly, most data is already transmitted prior to dialogue interaction upon opening the app. So if you are privacy aware, think about what you want the app to collect from you and whether or not it's worth it for you before even opening the app, because data is gone when you open it. It's still worth it for you to check out our paper. I just gave you the cliff notes. However, in the paper, we also looked at how content management platforms are used and what data points exactly are sent to which tracking endpoint. We looked at the tracking endpoints as a whole. This was the traffic transmission I just presented to you. However, we looked also into what specific data points are transmitted to which endpoint in specific. Well, thank you very much for listening. If you want to talk to me about this topic, please feel free to just talk to me outside. Otherwise, you can add me on LinkedIn or just write me an email. Check out our code at GitHub. We published our framework. And lastly, we collaborated with an NGO, so check them out as well. Thank you.